Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Nathan, I want to talk to you about the changing face of apologetics right now. So, how best to frame this? For a little while now, I would say for the past, depending on what circle you're in, but probably for the past 20 years, apologetics has fallen into disfavor with certain intellectuals. The way, and I'll spell out what I mean by that here in a second. The way this usually works, though, Nathan, is that it starts in the academy. So it starts with academics, and it takes quite a while for it to work its way into the popular imagination. This is the way many trends begin. They begin in the academy, and then they work their way into the broader culture. So this has been percolating for a while. So let me tell you where you go to look to spot some of these critiques. One place would be Leslie Newbigin's The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. That is a fantastic book. Nathan and I both would highly recommend it. It's great. But you'll notice that when the word apologetics comes up, the connotations for Newbigin are quite negative. And so there's a kind of scolding tone that comes in there. That's one place to look. And we'll talk a little bit about what the critique is here in a second, but I'm telling you some places to look.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, and now we're getting cooler, is James K.A. Smith. Definitely one of those philosophers who is...
Oh, I thought you were going to go Charles Taylor here.
Oh, I'll get Charles. Oh, yeah, so Charles Taylor. Yep. So Charles Taylor also, and it really just pick your text. I think Sources of the Self has some negative remarks. Certainly A Secular Age does. Then James K.A. Smith, he's cool because he's a philosopher who quotes theologians and philosophers. He quotes Augustine. He also quotes Merleau-Ponty, but he also talks about how he went to a Radiohead concert and how he listens to Death Cab for Cutie while he's writing. So come on, how cool is that? He has some quite withering remarks about apologetics. So this has been happening for a while now. So before we get to how apologetics is responding, how apologists right now, a new generation, are responding, and how they're responding is good or not, I'm struggling with the order here. Let's talk about the critique itself first. I think everybody wants to know that.
I think that's right. Yeah, let's back and start with Newbigin's critique. Let's do Newbigin, Taylor, Smith, summarize their critiques, and then that'll give us a platform to move on.
All right. Well, these are all very rich and subtle thinkers, so I can't possibly do justice to all of their deft arguments, but I think you can boil it down to a common denominator. And Nathan, I would like you to weigh in here too to make sure that I'm on track and that this is all working well. But they are going to say that apologetics, in sort of what's termed classical apologetics, and I think, Nathan, you and I both sometimes take issue with the term classic there because it really should be modern apologetics. This is not... Justin Martyr wasn't using this kind of apologetics. Classic apologetics assumes a neutral ground that we share with our worldview opponent, our ideological opponent, our theological opponent. So it assumes that we can all, if we just stand on this neutral ground and reason together, we can then reach some kind of consensus. So this is making a mistake. It's making an enlightenment mistake. And again, I'm running roughshod over some very subtle arguments, but I think if you really press into enlightenment sources, you're going to find that this carries some considerable force. In fact, I think I'm comfortable going so far as saying I completely agree with this. I think this is right. If we're assuming that we can come together on some kind of neutral ground, and sometimes scriptures are marshaled supposedly in support of this. Come, let us reason together. I'd submit to you that is not what's meant in that passage in Isaiah. But so the notion that reason becomes the ultimate arbiter of truth. So the problem with that is, well, if you're a Christian, you believe that... So on the one hand, you're happy about reason. Reason's wonderful. It's amazing that we can make contact with reality, to use the wonderful phrase from Michael Polanyi. But on the other hand, you have to admit reason is fallen and human beings are fallible. And the fruits of the Enlightenment have not been great. So assuming that reason is the final arbiter of truth also is problematic because, after all, if Christianity is true, we all ought to bow the knee not to reason, but to Christ alone. And so truth, ultimately, we know what we know because of divine revelation. So this is really a point of epistemology in some ways. And also, it's very easy. So if you're talking to somebody, let me tease this out with one more example, with just an example to try to clarify this. And then Nathan, I want you to weigh into and just flesh this out a little bit more for us. Let's say you're talking to a person who is a committed scientific naturalist. This person believes that material explanations are exhaustive and there is no God or gods, nothing like that. What neutral ground are you going to be able to meet this person on? It's not just that you have a disagreement about God's existence. It's that you have fundamental assumptions that are categorically incompatible. You have two completely different stories, two completely different worldviews, if you like, two completely different conceptions of reality. So there is no neutral ground there. So you can marshal all the arguments you want, say, in favor of the resurrection. You can give all the evidence that you think is really powerful. And this person, because they have categorically denied the very possibility of a miracle or anything supernatural, you may as well be defending the existence of a leprechaun or the tooth fairy. And given the story that this person is committed to, it does make sense that they hear you in those terms. Until you can admit the complete and total incompatibility of your starting points, your arguments are not going to get you very far. So Nathan, you can weigh in here too. Help me out.
So let me try to hit this from a couple different angles then, because it seems like modern apologetics has been crafted to reach that person and say, we're going to structure Christian apologetics in rationalist terms that even somebody from a naturalistic framework can get on board with. And so we've started to say, well, let's try to meet on the playing field of the naturalist and go from there. And now some of the other authors that we haven't gotten to are going to critique that setup, but that's not the only place that apologetics is necessarily done. It does mean, though, that Christians have done a better job engaging with, say, atheism or naturalistic atheism apologetically, because there's an attempt to speak the same language than it has to do with some of the other forms of maybe neo-paganism, which don't play by the same set of rules. So you're stuck in this situation with either you deny fundamental precepts of your own way of looking at the world as a Christian in order to reduce yourself to a naturalistic playing field in order to try to engage with the academic critiques of your faith, or you're looking at somebody who already believes something that you believe is totally illogical and irrational, and then you're going to try to use reason and logic to convince them that they're wrong. But if they're already content believing and it doesn't make any sense to you, then reason and logic isn't the best starting point to get them to see the world from a different angle. So there's a twofold. I'm just complicating what Cameron's already said here. If you go, we're going to reduce what we believe into the naturalistic framework in order to reach the atheist, sure, we can have a conversation there, but we're not playing with our full deck of cards. And if you take that same line of argumentation over into other spiritual worldviews, it's almost a non-starting point because the things that are important to you in that rationalistic framework don't matter to somebody who believes the world is stacked on top of turtles. So did I highlight the complication there?
You got it. So yeah, two big things right here. There is no such thing as neutral ground. And two, don't valorize reason as the final arbiter of truth. Both of those are misguided assumptions and they're mistaken maneuvers. So that's the major critique against apologetics, and I think it's a fair one. So what's the response been? Well, you're starting to see a response happening now, and you're going to see it in the oncoming years. So here's the other development that's happened over the course of this time. Apologetics has been slowly becoming a full-fledged academic discipline as well. It's possible to study it at a master's level. I did that. And now it's possible to earn a PhD in apologetics. Now, before, apologetics didn't have that kind of academic respect. the people, Christians who were who were happened to be academics, who had the most respect, who had earned the most respect, are not apologists for the most part. Alvin
Mhm.
Plantinga is, I would not call Alvin Plantinga an apologist. I mean, would you, Nathan?
Well, so we're in tricky water here, Cameron, because we need to define some terms. Um, I would say there's some phenomenal apologists. I would put Tim Keller in there. I would put N.T. Wright in there. I would
Sure.
put people who are preachers and theologians and are not professional apologists that are great and a lot of individual people that I know who are just good preachers and teachers who are apologists because wait for it,
Mhm.
the biblical mandate for apologetics is not necessarily, or is the category of a professional apologist doesn't appear in scripture. We'll put it that way. Um,
Correct. Yeah. But
so,
we'll get there. We're going to get
so
there. Yeah.
yeah, so
That's
that's
important.
so when we're talking about apologetics here right now in the critique of it, we're talking about the professional academic scholastic
Mhm.
YouTube version of
Well,
it, not the
yes.
historical enterprise.
Well, yeah. So, and now, so let me go back to Plantinga for a second, or Nicholas Wolterstorff. Those are two easy ones. They're friends. It's easy to pick on them. I like them both as philosophers. So there can be a lot of overlap between the task of apologetics and holding an academic post. So N.T. Wright, for instance, is a church historian, right? That's his day job, but he does a lot of defending. So in that sense, he is
Mhm.
an apologist. Alvin Plantinga, when I look at him, I don't see a pronounced concern for him to convince or persuade anyone. In fact, some of his arguments, though logically rigorous, are not particularly persuasive. So,
You've never heard of them for good reason.
yeah, no, I mean, he did write Warranted Belief, and he has written about the problem of evil. But when you look at those, he's not particularly concerned with reaching certainly a broad audience. He's concerned mainly with the integrity of the arguments that he's making. And so, and the same with Nicholas Wolterstorff. In fact, most of Wolterstorff has written on a variety of subjects. He's highly versatile as a thinker, but he hasn't written a lot, strictly speaking, defending Christianity. So my point is, these are both professional philosophers who earned a great deal of respect in the academy. Nicholas Wolterstorff is now at Yale, so I mean he's in one of the Ivy League schools, and so there's that. Now you do have somebody like William Lane Craig who has the training as, I mean, who is a professional philosopher and is clearly an apologist as well. So
Mhm.
there are those examples also. But now apologetics is becoming its own academic field, and it comes with all of the advantages and all the disadvantages. It has the advantage of greater rigor, greater subtlety, greater refinement. You have seasoned professionals who are now working on it, but it also has some of the weaknesses. I like the way that sociologists say that it generates what they call a discourse. And, when academics get together, they speak their own language, the language of their guild. And largely, it's a fairly exclusive language. And non-professionals, yeah, don't find it too inviting. So a lot of apologists, in other words, like to answer questions that apologists think are interesting and like to talk about arguments that apologists find interesting and nobody else does. So the danger is that it can become a little bit insular.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's happening right now. That's the response is apologetics is getting a whole lot more sophisticated right now. And I've been following, there are a number of different apologists. I'm going to name one because I think he's brilliant and he's worth. I would suggest you worth following him. Jonathan McClatchy, who I believe he did his PhD in biology. So I mean, he's really a professional scientist. He's an extremely refined apologist. Bethel McGrew, I think, and her whole family actually they're kind of
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
camp as well. But these guys they're really seasoned professional academics. They care a lot. I don't want to give the impression that they don't care about everyday people and laymen and non-academics. They do, but they're engaging a lot with academics and their arguments are very, very sophisticated.
Hang on a second.
But now you're
Wait a
also
second.
seeing, yeah, yeah. Let's hear it.
So there's a sense in which you're saying apologetics, but you jumped 3 generations of apologetics when you went to Bethel instead of her parents, because so let me work this
Well,
back.
her
some
whole
of you,
family, but yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah.
listen, but think with me a second here. So a lot of people think apologetics. Who are you thinking? Lee Strobel, uh, Josh McDowell.
Josh McDowell.
There's a whole
Yep.
thing there, right? Like that era.
Yep.
Are there other names that like were the big ones in that time?
Well, what I was getting to is some of these people are now being are now being critiqued pretty heavily by these guys in respectful terms. So one of our old crew, Nathan Max Baker Heitch,
Yeah.
has just recently come out with a pretty, I mean, respectable but thorough critique of William Lane Craig. And also now there are many of these guys are coming out with serious critiques of Mike Lacona. He's another name there, and Gary Habermas. And so in particular, now we don't need to get into the weeds on all of this stuff, but I mean, Nathan, you and I both are not the biggest fans of what's called the minimal facts approach. That's come under, I mean, this is very insider language. If you've followed apologetics closely or an apologetics junkie, minimal facts approach was a big deal. A lot of people now are calling it into serious question and providing some very robust answers. So you have a new generation of apologists who are further refining this, taking the discipline further. And so you're going to see a lot of people talk about, well, what are we going to do? You know, the life of the mind isn't valued. Oh, it is. There's a sophisticated new group of apologists emerging.
Yeah, but here's
There's
my
some
point.
good and there's some bad there.
Well, yeah, but so
Yeah.
there's always this idea of what's happening academically is 20 years behind or 20 years ahead of what's happening like in the practice of that field. So
Right.
if you look at the critique
Yeah.
for the minimalist facts case for the resurrection, that came from Tim and Lydia McGrew, who are Bethel's parents. So that, I mean, that's a
Years
whole
ago. Yeah.
generation ago.
Yes, that's right.
And you said Bethel.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that there's some category like, oh, the case for minimal facts, that's really neat. Like, okay, that was critiqued pretty roundly about 20 years ago. And now we're talking about like the people who critiqued it. Like we're almost
Children. Yeah.
where academic apologetics is at is like the children of the new ideas you're hearing of. I don't know what to do with that practically.
Well, I'm willing to bet that many of you listening have not heard of Tim McGrew, even though he's an absolutely, I mean, he is a stellar apologist. You'd have to put him at the top of the list in terms of the integrity of his arguments, his sophistication. He's fantastic. But he didn't have that popular. So for a while, I'm going to say stuff that just runs the risk of sounding offensive, but for a while, apologists could get away with, because it was so emerging as it did as a discipline, it was so new that it could get away with arguments that were a little less sophisticated sometimes. It really could, because people would welcome it and were excited that the life of the mind was being addressed. So some of these writers and thinkers had a part to play, but at the same time, there were people there who were making more careful arguments and were saying, hey, I think some of what you're saying is conceding too much to your secular opponents. You're actually accepting the terms in which they've framed the debate around God. And if their terms are the wrong terms, you ought not to accept those terms at all. You can have a different starting point.
Okay.
So there's that neutral ground piece again. So yeah, I think that's a salient factor here as well.
All right, let me drop a name in here, and because I think there's another category. So right now we're talking about the academic side of apologetics, and I don't think when we say, I mean, Cameron and I have worked professionally in the field of professional apologetics both for over a decade now, so we're not anti the enterprise at all. But it does, I think, if somebody who's kind of looked around inside the vehicle can say, "Hey, here's some things to think about," that's where we're speaking from. All right, let me give you this name. You tell me where he fits in. David Wood.
David Wood. Well, I mean, I think David Wood is a polemicist, and he has a very particular audience for the most part. So he is, and again, so it's weird because some people are going to know who David Wood is. He's known, I think, he has a wider audience sometimes by his association with Nabil Qureshi. He was the one who actually ended up leading Nabil to the Lord. But he also, his main audience are Muslims now. And Muslims, if you know anything, so he knows his audience. He really does. So
Okay.
I'm between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, I think some of his tactics are a bit ghoulish at times. He will, he will make skit videos taking literally some of the injunctions from the hadiths, regarding what you do with animal blood, things like that. So some of this stuff looks a little sideshow-esque to me. But again, what's interesting about Wood is he really knows his audience, and he is brilliant. Let's say that he is an absolutely exquisite speaker, debater. But a Muslim audience, usually you're going to have they are by disposition usually a very passionate audience, very involved, and they're blunt. They want you to get to the heart and the substance. So it's not like some polite kind of mannered discussion that you would have at the Oxford Union. This is let's go right now for all of the all of the key substantive issues, and let's do so in the most unsparing terms. So in that
Well,
sense, David Wood has found
all
an
right.
audience there. I'm not sure I'm going where you
No,
think I'm
well,
going to go,
no, no,
where
no.
you thought I was
Okay,
going to go
yeah.
there,
So,
Nathan.
I don't need you to spell out David Wood in great detail for everybody. I'm just saying that there is so it's apologetics, but it's outside of the academic. It's relying. So there's the academic work that's being done in apologetics that you have a lot of other people who are feeding off of and working off of, but then using that material to engage um
Now, David Wood has a
subsections.
PhD though, so
Yeah, that's true.
I'd categorize him as an academic. He's not a professor, but yeah, but
I'm,
here's
I'm
okay. So that
You
brings
see what
me
I'm saying? There are like
to
multiple levels here of
yeah,
like people who are working like at the theoretical level, and then there are people who are understanding the theoretics and then
yeah.
repackaging it and making it palatable to the rest of us.
Okay, well, that brings me to something that I want to bring up here, and there's a problem that's emerging here. I see it as a huge problem, and it's elitism. And it came up. I noticed a comment recently because I'm mainly an online lurker in some of those
Uh,
apologetic circles.
Is that something you?
I'm
Yeah,
not going to
okay.
spend
I think
hours,
if you connect that to
yeah,
apologetics, that's
talking
an
to people.
okay phrase to say. But other than that, I don't know if I would use online lurker as a self description.
Oh yeah, sure. It has some other negative connotations. So just lurking in on conversations and seeing where the debates are going. So I'm not gonna spend hours responding to any of that. But I want to see what people say. And one person said recently, the problem with apologetics is that anybody can call themselves an apologist, and they can go out there and be completely irrational and illogical. And so the implication was we need more of these PhDs and professional apologists. Pro- Sorry guys, apologetics ain't a professional sport. So we need to get back. So apologetics includes the academic side. It'll include that. And we're great. Thank the Lord for the people who are working, laboring to get PhDs, who are putting in that work and who are able and willing to engage with other academics. But if you go back to 1 Peter 3:15 through 16, and you look at the thrust of defense of Christ that runs through Scripture, this is an injunction that's incumbent upon all believers, not just professional philosophers, lawyers, and doctors, and politicians, and TED talkers. This is everybody. And so the impression that people get sometimes when they see these kinds of discussions is, well, these people are so brilliant, but I'm not like that. I could never do that. And I'm never going to read all those books. I'm not going to read Charles Taylor. So I guess this isn't for me. And that to me is very, very sad. The truth is, not everybody should read Charles Taylor. That's fine. Not everybody is built like an academic. That's fine too. And you don't have to be. Apologetics includes that, but it's not limited to that by any means. It really has to do with how you articulate your relationship with Jesus Christ. And if it's about your relationship with Christ, it's predicated on love. And if it's predicated on love, all of us have at our disposal the ability to talk in certain terms or to convey in certain ways a relationship that we care about, a person we care about. We can do that. Some people can express it through highly articulate verbiage and speeches. Some people can communicate their love of Christ through great acts of hospitality, but taking care of other people. There are more than there is more than one way to provide a defense of Christ. So that's just one point I wanted to make here is that apologetics includes the academic side of things, but it's not limited to it. And that's one of the weaknesses I see in this new guard emerging. Great intellectual sophistication, but there's an elitism that's coming with it and an insularity that's coming with it too. Sometimes, not always. we really need to guard against that.
I was just telling somebody, I think it was yesterday. I was running a little weekend circuit in my itinerant preaching and speaking. I can't remember where this was, but I was telling somebody this example that my grandpa gave of how he thought about apologetics. Um, one point a couple years ago, we were having dinner, and he's like, you know what? He's like, I'm 87 years old, and I know shockingly little about how my digestive system works, like in the intricate mechanics of how it all goes down. He's like, what I have known is that I put my food on my fork and I put the fork in my mouth and I eat the food and it tastes good to me or it doesn't, but I eat it and I'm nourished and I grow. And he's like, that's great. And he's like, and that has worked for me for multiple decades. And he's like, so that's what I know. Now, he said, if something with my digestive system goes wrong, there better be somebody someplace who spent 8 years studying how the human digestive system works who can help me get that sorted out. And so the point he was making there, I think, is similar in the sense that for the vast majority of people who are loving their neighbors well, sharing their faith, having meaningful relationships, or even preaching and teaching to a significant degree, what you know is God is good. Jesus is just. I put the food on my fork. I put the fork in my mouth. I spiritually grow and I'm maintained and I'm healthy. And then every once in a while, somebody's going to say, hey, but there's a kink in the system here. How do we sort that out? And then that's really where the benefit of people who are doing the hard labor of systematically analyzing all the parts and pieces of the digestive system, so to speak, here can really be helpful to us. But what we don't want to get ourselves into a situation is I feel like, you know what, I'm not going to enjoy my breakfast until I understand my entire digestive system. So
Mhm.
there's a bit of a give and take there, but one of those is livable and fun, and the other
Yeah.
can be oppressive.
Well, and that brings me. I think we need to. We're the time is getting away from us because we're very invested in the subject, and I suspect we'll come back to it. And by the way, this is one subject that Nathan and I both think would be a very fruitful discussion once we launch some kind of a discussion community for thinking out loud. We would love to hear your thoughts on this and talk about this a little bit more. But I think I want to bring this to a place where we answer this question, Nathan. And I'll go first. I'm not going to just pose it to you. I'll answer it, and then I want to hear what you have to say too. A big one is, who is apologetics for? So I will submit to you here, and this is, again, think about this, chew it over. I don't think apologetics is evangelistic primarily. I think apologetics is mainly for Christians. And here, let me give a few reasons as to why I think that's the case. I'm going to pull up an Austin Farrer quote in a second because it kind of sums up my philosophy of apologetics, but I'll do that in a second. But part of why I say that is, if you look at a lot of the stories of people who were moved by apologetics and who were really drawn into it played an instrumental role in their crossing the threshold of a church. Many of those stories involve people who were Christians or were Christians or grew up in a Christian household and then wandered away for a time. And there's a common refrain in many of them: I had serious questions. Nobody was willing to answer them. And so they assumed Christianity was, bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt, or it wasn't viable. They went to college. This is, a very famous version of the story. And, it's true. I've heard this one over and over again. But then lo and behold, they went to some conference or they ran into some friend who was an apologist. And then they suddenly discovered that these questions did indeed have answers. And so then this was instrumental in sort of drawing them back to the church. So my point there is, the salient factor there is that a lot of these people had a foundation to begin with. They had a Christian heritage to draw on. And apologetics, if it's going to do anything kind of in the evangelistic vein, tends to work better with people who have some kind of a Christian heritage or some kind of a Christian background. That intellectual
Mhm.
furniture is there. But when it comes to actually, if you're meeting somebody who's truly a hardened skeptic, truly very reflective and very principled in where they stand as far as their worldview, and it's outside the church, I don't think that apologetics is particularly going to be particularly helpful for them. I think you're going to find that you reach an impasse very quickly. I think apologetics mainly is helpful to believers in strengthening their faith, deepening their faith, and encouraging them along those lines. That's what I think the real service of apologetics is. So I don't think it's primarily for non-believers. And here's the Austin Farrer quote really quickly. I'll leave you with this and then hand it over to Nathan to either disagree with me or push back slightly or whatever he wants to do. But Austin Farrer says, what seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational, hold on real quickly here. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. I think that's a great balance. That would be my philosophy of apologetics right there.
Yeah, and I think we can, without shocking anybody, say that this is something that you and I have seen emerging in the last several years, and was part of the reason that you and I were in a little bit of a weird camp ourselves within our former employer. Is that we saw the danger that happens is you do run into the person who says, I had these, grew up in the church, walked away, had the, Cameron's whole story there. Apologetics was really helpful to me. And then the types of people who are interested in that are all often very much kind of like talkers, thinkers, like the type of stuff that people tend to start putting them in leadership roles. So there's like a personality that's also associated with that ends up with them being a person who talks a lot about how they came to faith. Maybe I'm oversaying that, but what I want to say here is that those are great stories, and they are real, and they are true, and they are an extremely small percentage of the people. If you were to poll the people in your church, how many of them came to faith through serious analytical apologetic research and study? It's going to be a small amount. So it's
vanishingly
great.
Small.
Yeah. But so it's great for what it is, but let's not act like that is the majority way, because then what happens is this false illusion that belief all throughout scripture, God moves first. That's what starts, like, no one can come unless I draw and call, so there's a sense in which the false illusion is that apologetics offers a system for belief, that there's a method to, and there's a structure. And it's like, I really want this person to be a Christian. And so
yeah.
what are the moves? Like, how do I memorize the algorithm of the Rubik's Cube that I can solve this problem every time? And
right.
And every once in a while that works, but it's a false promise to think that that's the structure of actual legitimate belief and faith in Christ. Cameron.
Well, yeah, and even so, some of you may be thinking, you mentioned Nabil Qureshi. He was persuaded through apologetics. No, he wasn't. I'm going to push back on that. Nabil Qureshi was ambushed by God. If you read his Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, yes, David Wood was a servant of the Lord and a messenger and a faithful messenger and played a part. But Nabil also had a series of highly prophetic, highly specific, miraculous dreams, which is a way, by the way, that the Lord often reaches out to Muslims. So I have a lot of friends who had lived in radically different ways from Christianity. All of them were ambushed by God. All of them had some lesser Saul of Tarsus road to Damascus kind of experience. Even my dad, there was something like that. That what they had to experience was a revelation that just obliterated the hardness of their hearts. And no argument alone would have done that. I'm not saying arguments aren't valuable. They are. They're necessary in some cases, but they're not sufficient. And I think we really need to bear that in mind. Even if you think you have a paradigm example of somebody who is the hyper analytical person, you're still talking about a human being in possession of a heart. And there's no unhardening of a heart without the Holy Spirit's action.
Yeah. So I guess, so here's what you shouldn't hear us saying, like, the new phase of apologetics is all over and it's not helpful. Not what we're saying. It's extremely helpful. And a lot of people do.
No, we're grateful for it. Yeah.
And a lot of people, and the other thing we have to recognize is there are people who need to know at deeper levels in all kinds of categories. Some of you would never get in a car if you didn't understand what a spark plug is, just because you need to know how the thing that you're in works. And others of you might not have a clue how a distributor cap used to work and what modern fuel injectors are. Like, so So people are going to have different questions at different levels, and that's okay. You can still ride in the vehicle. But we don't want to idolize or make a system out of a spiritual interaction that happens between people and the Lord. So, I think most apologists are aware of this, Cameron, and we're not, so
Mhm.
we're not
Yeah.
critiquing all apologists. Most people say, you know what, God draws people, and sometimes people get hung up on a question, and that's where apologetics can kind of come in and remove that roadblock so that the person can continue on their journey with the Lord. So I think in its best instantiation, that's the way that actually works. But I do think it's important that every once in a while we just check in here with our listeners, who are by and large, I would imagine, pretty heavily interested in apologetics, and just all remind ourselves of the way that this really is intended to work, and to be excited about the future of where this is going, but not falsely trust in that or to make an idol of it.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think we'll return to this subject again as well. We'll have occasion to do so. But in the meantime, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.